Okay, let's get at it. William Cullen Bryant was born on November 3rd, 1794, to Peter Bryant and Sarah Snell. And Peter Bryant was a physician and a surgeon, and Sarah Snell came from a very wealthy family. So a biography I found from the Poetry Foundation said that there was like a lot of financial struggles in William's like early life because his dad made some like really weird financial decisions and they didn't pan out, and then they lost their house and all their money, so they had to live with Sarah's parents, who were quite wealthy. So William's dad was also a politician, which inspired a lot of his writing whenever he actually started writing. So he enrolled in Williams College at the age of 16, and he wanted to transfer to Yale, but he didn't because he dropped out within his first year of Williams College because he hated it. So he decided to study law, like privately instead. He was like, this will be a good idea, this will be a good time. And he began practicing law whenever he was like 21. He practiced it for a few years before he became an editor. Okay. The first thing that he had published was The Embargo, which was like a satire. He was asking President Jefferson to resign, again with the political thing. He wrote that whenever he was 13, and it was published a couple months later. Something I found from poets.org said that he published his first collection of poems, which he cleverly entitled Poems, in 1821 the first time, but then he published several editions after that to like keep it updated with poems that he was writing, because he did release, that was like his like core time of releasing poems. Really, he wrote for his whole life, but his most influential works came from whenever he was in that like very young age window. So he continued writing and working as an editor until he died in 1878. He, from the Poetry Foundation, I found this. He was giving a speech, because he gave a lot of speeches, and he was like in his 80s, and they were like, hey guy, let us drive you home. And he was like, nah, I got it. So he walks over to his friend's house, and then it's really hot, so he passes out, hits his head, gets a concussion, has a stroke, and dies within the like a few days. So there's that. That was on June 12th, 1878, and since he was considered the first citizen of New York, New York mourned his death, and they like put all their flags at half-staff, and like a bunch of citizens like sent in their own like eulogies and stuff. So he meant a lot to them, obviously. The textbook mentions that Bryant wanted to be able to support himself with just his poems, but like that was really unrealistic at the time, and it still kind of is. Like it's really hard to just write and do nothing else and be financially stable. So that's why he practiced law and he was an editor for so long, is because that gave him some kind of like income. Forgot where I was. He was editor-in-chief at the New York Evening Post until he died in 1878. So that was a position that he held for like a very long time. On to his most famous work, which is Thanatopsis. So whenever William was young, he studied Greek and Latin with his uncle, and that's kind of where the name comes from. So Thanatos means death, and opsis means like view or sight. So it literally means a view of death. And the important thing about Bryant's work, especially this, is like he wrote it whenever he was 17, so that was in 1811, but it wasn't published in the North American Review until 1822. So he was like right there at the beginning of like the American Romantic movement, really. And so he kind of started introducing these things. Like he wasn't like the father of it, but he was giving audiences like tastes of these things, I guess you could say. Basically, it's about death, as you could probably guess. At this point in his life, he had a really rough year where like everyone he, or like not everyone he cared about, but like 3 people died and like that were really close to him in the course of a year. And so this poem is really about like finding nature as a source of comfort and like processing death and, you know, like what does mortality mean. So he says, when the thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, go forth under the open sky and list to nature's teachings. Why did my laptop turn off? Anyways, he continues to talk about some things that are kind of disturbing. He talks about how the earth nourished us, so one day our corpses will nourish the earth, and that's just the reality of it. He talks about how the earth is this big tomb that everybody's gonna lay in, whether you're like a king or a queen or like, I don't know, whatever, or just like some random person, like everybody's gonna do it, so it happens to everybody. So basically, he ends the poem with this really nice sentiment. I think he means for it to be nice. He says, approach thy grave like no. Let me just start that over. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. So basically, like, he's like, embrace your death whenever it comes and see it as a natural occurrence. Don't, like, worry about it for your whole life. The textbook says that, also I'm getting into his influences now. Might want to introduce that. Sorry. Anyways, the textbook says that Bryant influenced Ralph Waldo Emerson's works, and he was acclaimed by writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman's whole thing was like he was defending him because a lot of people weren't into what Bryant was like writing about. And basically, Walt Whitman was like, you guys are idiots, he's pretty cool. So, love how technical that was. His poems were read all over America and Europe, and obviously, like, New York held him as like a very important writer. You know, like, he's not really talked about much today. Like, his poems have kind of been forgotten, but like the influence that he's had on like all of the writers after him hasn't been, like, you can't get rid of that. So his writing style and his subject matter was very much so like in line, or like in line with the early, you can see how it developed into like the romantic movement. And lastly, as I am running out of time, um his big thing was like political involvement. So, you know, he was a part of the Free Soil Party. He helped found it, I think, is what the textbook said. And then he left that and helped found the Republican Party. And he was like big for like prison reform, and like he was like anti-slavery and everything. So he was very like progressive thinking, and like, you know, he just had he was getting stuff done, and that's how his dad was too. So that was where those influences came from. But that's William Cullen Bryant. So